And Garrett doesn't have a clue.
Picture this. You and some buddies plan a trip to burn up some vacation days. The group decides to go play in some rocks and mud at Tuttle Creek in Kansas. One of the buddies is bringing a Jeep, so you need to make sure your rig is perfect, as that Jeep will get stuck. As you're prepping your Mini Raptor Sport Trac, the check engine light comes on. You should probably fix this before the trip. I hooked up my OBD Link MX Plus, scanned the codes, and came back with P0171, System 2 Lean, Bank 1, and P0442, evap small leak detected. There's a high chance these two faults are related, so we'll start with the System 2 Lean Bank 1 fault. During a test drive, I used the OBD Link to monitor long-term fuel trims. Fuel trim is the measure of how much fuel the computer adds or takes out of the engine in terms of percentage. Ideally, we're looking for anything under 5 to 10% positive or negative. Anything above 25% in either direction and the computer stops reading and throws codes. Well, there you have it. Under load, we reach 25%. Let's check for some vacuum leaks. On this engine, Bank 1 is the passenger side and Bank 2 is the driver's side. The first place I always check for a vacuum leak is the PCV hoses, especially since I have modified the intake on this. OEM Sport Tracs have a hose coming from the passenger side valve cover to the intake tube. There's a second pipe that connects from under the throttle body to on the intake manifold and runs around the back of the engine to the driver valve cover. This is where the PCV valve is. Everything looked okay on mine, so it's time to use an old school method, spraying flammable aerosol all over the engine. If there's any vacuum leaks, the flammable aerosol will be pulled into the engine and combusted, causing the engine RPM to increase. I'm spraying all around the sides of the valve covers and the intake manifold ports, and all over the PCV hoses I checked earlier. And nada. No engine RPM increase. So no noticeable vacuum leaks. I think we need to move on to some fuel checks. I'm going to check the fuel pressure with this fuel pressure gauge. Most modern fuel-injected engines will have some sort of Schrader valve on the fuel rails. This fuel pressure gauge connects to this port. On the Sport Trac, the port is located on the passenger fuel rail at the back of the engine. We are looking for 60 to 65 psi of fuel pressure with the ignition on and when the engine is running. The Sport Trac has a mechanical returnless fuel system, with the pressure regulator being part of the fuel pump assembly. With cycling the key a couple times, the fuel pressure only reached 35 psi. With the engine running at idle, it reached 55 psi. Throttling the engine caused the pressure to drop significantly. The Bank 1 fuel rail is the furthest from the fuel pump, which means it would have the highest pressure drop, setting the System 2 Link Bank 1 fault code. So we either have a failing fuel pump or a failing fuel pressure regulator. Those are both part of the fuel sending unit, so let's drop the tank and get that replaced. This job will be easier with a nearly empty fuel tank. Trust me, they're not fun to lift full of fuel. First step is to remove the fuel filter and vent tubes. Then we will support the fuel tank and remove the single strap bolt, then the two front mount bolts. This will let us lower it to disconnect the fuel lines. There is not much room to reach the connectors off the fuel sending unit. It may be easier to remove the driver rear wheel fender liner and access them through the side. Also, the main fuel line is made of a nylon tube, and this does not bend much before kinking. I ended up getting a crack in mine and replaced it with a section of rubber fuel hose. With the tank fully lowered, we can pull out from underneath and get to work on the sending unit. Disconnect the fuel pressure sensor, then remove the 6 bolts that hold the sending unit in place. It's a good idea to mark the orientation of the sending unit for installing the new one, and there's a helpful arrow stamped into the top of the unit. Carefully remove the sending unit from the tank. This part is the fuel pressure regulator. And this part is the fuel pump. Man, that pickup sock is nasty. Nasty. Before installing the new sending unit, clean out any debris that collected in the fuel tank. Mine seemed to have some reddish sand. Properly orient the sending unit and then tighten the bolts by hand. Reinstall of the tank is reverse of removal. Fuel tank is back in. Let's check and see if the fix worked. Key on, we're getting 65 psi. Engine running, we're getting 60 to 65 psi even when throttling. Fixed! Woohoo! We can now clear the codes and take a test drive. One feature of the OBD-Link MX Plus is the Performance tab, which uses the vehicle information to calculate performance marks. Before doing this project, I did a test run quarter-mile pass using the app and dongle. The Sport Trac did an 18.74 second pass. After replacement, it did an 18.44 second pass. There you have it. The fuel pump was the problem all along. Or maybe it was the regulator. Either way, thanks for watching.
I'd stop there. Okay, stop.